Hey, can you let me know if you can see me or hear me? Very good. All right, then let's go ahead and begin. Tonight we're debating the resolution progressive flat tax, and I'm going to be presenting two arguments in favor of that resolution. We're going to begin by talking about how the progressive tax is unfair, and then we're going to talk about how the progressive tax is complicated and harmful and compare and contrast the two. Let's begin with how it's unfair. The progressive tax is unfair because it treats people differently based on their wealth, assuming that one group of people owes a greater debt to society than another group does. And I think that's unfair and unreasonable for a couple reasons. First of all, arguably, the rich actually burden society the least. The reason is there aren't that many of them. We call them the top 1% for a reason. But additionally, they're generally speaking going to prefer private services to public services. A good few examples are healthcare. They prefer private healthcare, transportation, and education especially. But additionally, they're likely to not draw on welfare type programs like disability benefits and that kind of thing because ordinarily the government either blocks them out of those programs or they just pay for it themselves. Secondarily to that issue, I think it is wrong to treat people differently based on how much money they have. I think that the progressive income tax implies a discriminatory element that is unfair and unacceptable in a pluralistic society. So, in opposition to the progressive tax, I would argue for a flat tax which treats everyone the same regardless of how much money they make. For example, in a 10% flat tax, if you make $10 a year, you put $1 in the pot. And if you make $1 million a year, you put $100,000 in the pot. It doesn't pretend that one group owes more to society than the other, but is rather flat and fair. Now, let's look at the second argument, which contends that the progressive tax is complicated and harmful. Now, progressive tax codes kind of need to be complicated simply by the virtue of what they are. They have to define things like income brackets and that sort of thing. But they tend to become complicated very fast. The United States income tax, for instance, is comprised of 73,000 pages at this point. And this leads to a couple of unique problems. First of all, it creates loopholes through which the wealthy can escape because they can hire very smart lawyers who understand how the tax code works to get them out of paying their taxes. Additionally, no one understands how the tax code actually works except for lawyers who are experts in reading it. Um, Additionally, the progressive tax actually harms economic growth. And the reason it does is because it penalizes success, because it says that the more money you make, the more of your money we're going to take from you. And that creates an attitude where you are not incentivized to actually be successful. So I would argue that the flat tax is better in two ways. First of all, it's less complicated. The great economist Milton Friedman, who proposed the flat tax, said you could fill your taxes out on a postcard-sized piece of paper, and so it's less complicated, vastly less complicated. But it's also beneficial because it benefits the economy. It incentivizes economic growth by removing penalties from being successful. It actually encourages people to be successful, to make more money, to accumulate capital, and to benefit the economy. So I support the resolution because the progressive tax is unfair, complicated, and harmful, and in every way the flat tax is superior.
Alrighty, can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me? Excellent. I've similarly divided my case into two aspects. One about what makes a just tax system, and two, what makes one which is economically efficient. So the first, just one. I'll address your points. The first thing you said is that it treats people differently because it says the rich owe more to society. I would argue that, contrary to your claim, the rich actually do owe more of their income to society. And the reason for that is that as businesses grow, they tend to take advantage of more government services, which small businesses don't. So, for example, mum and dad with their fish and chip shop don't take advantage of the same degree of supply chains, for example. They don't take advantage of economic international trade deals. They don't take advantage of all of these sorts of government services, which they would usually owe their income. So it means that for individuals who only make a very small amount of income, it is highly likely that that is largely just their own labor. That is them making a consensual transaction with another person. Yes, the government facilitated a safe society, I guess, and so they owe a little bit of it to the government, but they don't owe as much as someone who is taking advantage of like every public road at every available opportunity, all the ports, all the trade deals, all of those other things. The next thing is that you're saying the rich burden society with their less because they take advantage of private health insurance. I don't think this is a grounds to tax them less because they consent to take up private health insurance. That is their choice, and they're rewarded for that choice because private health insurance is better. So that is something they consent to and does not qualify them for a tax break. What do I say as to why it's actually more fair? The first thing I've talked about is the just reason in terms of the rich take up more of their income, so owe more of their income to the government. But secondly, because the percentage of your income isn't actually reflective of the real impact it is. I think that if you can consider tax as a contribution for society, it should be measured in terms of how much does that sacrifice actually affect you, not is the percentage right? Because like math doesn't really reflect the way in which taxation affects people's lives. For the rich, a 50% of their income doesn't mean that they have to sacrifice as much as a poor person if they were to give up 50% of their income. Because for example, someone who is very poor, 50% of their income is the difference between sending their kids to a college or feeding them, right? Whereas for a rich person, it is like, do I need to buy as much luxury goods? So the same degree of sacrifice isn't there, and the tax code should reflect that, which is why progressive taxation is better. I also have some utilitarian reasons to suggest, which I'll go into later, but just to touch on yours quickly. You basically said that loopholes are a problem. I agree, loopholes are a problem, but they're also actually not a feature of the progressive taxation. They're a feature of crony capitalism and tax breaks. A progressive taxation where there are tax brackets, yes, it is a little bit more complicated, but it is the sort of thing which I learned how it worked in year 10 in high school. So I'm pretty sure people can do it. And the reason for that is that it's basically just, you look at your income and you figure out what tax bracket you're in. That is not overly complicated. Loopholes are more a result of different sorts of tax exemptions. I'm also against those, so that is not part of the debate. The next part, you're saying it prohibits growth because there isn't a sufficient incentive to get rich. I would just point to all of the people who are still wanting to get rich despite there being a progressive taxation system to suggest that this incentive doesn't actually exist. Obviously, people still want to get rich, even if it means taxing more.
All right, thank you, sir. I'll begin with your arguments claiming that the progressive tax code is more just. You argued that the rich do owe more because they take advantages of more government services. You talked about trade deals and international commerce and that sort of thing. I just want to point out that markets are not government services. So when a rich person starts a company and creates a corporation or whatever you're talking about, they're taking advantage of a free market. They're not taking advantage of government services. They are providing services in a market. The government doesn't facilitate that. The only thing the government does is it gets in their way and makes it more difficult for them to run their business through things like taxation. But secondly, with your argument on corporations, I would note that you're actually talking about the corporate tax. You're not talking about an income tax. Those are two different things. Corporate taxes actually are normally flat. I know ours in America is currently pegged at 35% and is about to go down to. But just to clarify, there's a difference between a corporate tax and an income tax. Next, you talk about how the percentage of the tax does not equate to the impact. In other words, it's very difficult for a poor person to pay a flat tax. First of all, I'd like to point out that the answer is not to reject the flat tax, but the answer would actually be to lower government services. And the reason is the progressive income tax. It isn't the problem. Government services are the problem because government services add more expense, and as a result, the government takes more taxes from people, which ends up lowering economic activity because the government is more likely to misuse your money. Now, let's talk about loopholes. You say that loopholes are the result of crony capitalism, and I would agree that there are examples of cronyism that create loopholes. I'd like to point out that your position in the resolution actually increases loopholes, and the reason it increases loopholes is because progressive tax codes are complicated, and they actually they become more complicated. So my plan is very simple. My plan says we're going to take tax law and we're going to put it on a postcard. Your plan says that 79,000 page tax document is actually okay, and it's actually beneficial. I want to go back and address one more thing, and that is the concept that it'll hurt the poor more. I just want to clarify my responses here because I got distracted because my phone went off in the middle of it. Just to be clear here, the answer here is not to reject the flat tax. The answer is to reject the amount of services that the government is charging you for. And furthermore, I would suggest that it is unreasonable to say that we should not have a flat tax because the poor will have to pay more. What I think would be reasonable to say is that in the status quo, under a progressive tax system, the poor are not paying their fair share because they're treated differently than the rich simply by virtue of the fact that they're poor. And I don't think that is an accurate way to judge how people should be taxed. I think everyone should be taxed at the same rate because we haven't seen legitimate substantial proof that rich people actually do take more from society and therefore deserve to pay more taxes.
Okay. But first point on markets and not government services. That would be a rebuttal if what I was describing were markets. When the government pays for things like a police force and an army and makes sure that the economy is not in wartime, or when it does things like pay for courts to enforce contract law, those are not market features. Those are government features. The fact that the markets create wealth means that, yes, the wealthy own some of their income, which is why I would never support a 100% taxation. But it would just be intellectually dishonest to say that the government has zero hand in the manufacturing of the wealth. The fact that you can advertise, right, and that freedom of speech is protected by who? The government. The fact that you can sue if someone breaks your contract. Who enforces that at the end of the day? The government. The people who provide all the incentives and disincentives which allow you to operate your business in a peaceful area is the government. So ultimately, yes, markets is why the rich people deserve some of their income. And what I'm suggesting is that those other things which are taken advantage of more by higher earners is why they owe more of their income to the government. The second thing you said is that there's a break between corporate and income tax. I agree. What I would suggest is that those who earn higher incomes are likely to be paid by corporations who are taking more of those things. Similarly, whether you declare your income as being like corporate or personal income, like a lot of your personal income is things like my corporation paid me a dividend, or I am the director, so I got paid by my corporation. So the fact that, like, yes, it is like one more break in the causal link, but it is not a significant one. Next thing you said is that poor people will struggle, and your answer is to just remove services. I would point to the fact that the poor people are also the one who use the services. So you would have to prove to me that the amount of money they receive in services effectively is lesser than the amount of money you'll be giving them in a tax break. That seems wrong because progressive taxation taxes the rich more. But also I would suggest that actually, that strictly speaking, you're actually moving away from your burden in this debate. Because what this debate isn't about is whether we should raise or lower taxes. It's about, given that we have a certain amount of tax that we need, where do we source that tax from? What I would suggest is that I can say, yeah, look, for the purpose of the debate, let's lower services. And when it comes to paying for the army, we shouldn't charge the poor a cent, and we should charge only the rich for that, for example. And that would allow, by your own analysis, even more economic activity, because I'm putting even more hands of money into the hands of those who will spend. So actually, you don't get to fiddle with the total tax amount. You just get to say, given that we have a tax amount, where do we draw that income from? What I'm suggesting is that if your goal is to raise economic activity, taking it from those who are unlikely to spend it is a way to increase economic activity, rather than taking it from those who will have to make some very difficult decisions. The last thing, your loopholes argument at this point is just kind of bad. You're like, it's more complex, therefore loopholes. Like, you can have degrees of complexity, obviously. I don't have to stand for the 72,000 page per tax document. I could put a progressive taxation in one.
All right, great. So let's begin with, which is the government creates services like courts and police forces, and those are not markets. I agree that those are not market services. Those are public services. But I would contend that everyone actually benefits equally from the military and the courts. And the reason is the military provides the same service to everyone. It protects a country's interest domestically and its seas. Everyone benefits the same. So everyone has equal opportunity to access the courts. But my second response would be a question to you. How do you determine who benefits the most from society? What you're doing is you're implying an exponential increase in complexity. Because now, if your tenet of progressive taxation is, we have to determine how much the rich benefit versus how much the poor, and then we determine how much we tax people, you are implying what I would, as a student of economics and law, I would say is an impossible burden of complexity. You have to come up with an objective standard that allows you to determine how much a given person benefits from society and then tax them, quote unquote, fairly. I don't think that's possible. I don't think the government can equitably determine that, and so I think you're implying a level of complexity ad absurdum. Now let's talk about how you discussed poor people using public services and diminishing those public services would hurt them. I've got two responses to this. First of all, voluntary donations could replace public services, or the marketplace would replace public services. You see programs like Kickstarter today, as well as simply donations from people who have money to give away. But secondly, I'd like to point out some numbers that I prepared before the debate round, that the flat actually generate more revenue than a progressive tax. Let's take an example of America. In America, our income tax generates about half of the government's revenue. Our current tax program generates $1.8 trillion in revenue annually for the United States federal government. If you were to implement a 15% flat tax rate of the total income in my country, then that would generate $1.9 trillion. So you would actually see a $100 billion net increase in revenue generated if you were to implement a 15% flat tax over the current tax system. So that is a clear-cut numerical example of how a flat tax would actually generate more money than a progressive tax would. And I want to finish by discussing this argument about loopholes. You talked about how there are degrees of complexity, and I actually agree with you. There are degrees of complexity. Unfortunately, the size of the American tax code is indicative of the number of tax codes in countries all around the world. I would challenge you to come up with a system that would allow you to print a tax code on a postcard that utilized a progressive framework. I guarantee you can't do it. That was one of Milton Friedman's great you could put the flat tax on a postcard, and that you could say you write out your income, you multiply it by the decimal of the rate that you're taxed at, and then there's how much tax you owe for the year. You mail that check for the government. That is a level of simplicity that your tax program can simply never accomplish.
I'm going to go from the back forward. The tax program I'm advocating for is one which was described to me and my classmates when we were 15 years old. It's not difficult. The complexity you're talking about, loopholes, comes from things like corn subsidies. It comes from other things. It is not a feature of progressive taxation, and you have not at any point offered any analysis other than it's complicated to prove that point. The last thing you said before that was about more revenue. I'm actually going to pass the mic here because it seems you've ignored my last point. So just let me be very clear here. In this debate, you don't get to talk about revenue because it's not about how much the government should tax. It's given that we want a certain amount of tax, where does the government take it from? So if you does that make sense, right? In that you can't actually make any claims about which tax generates more revenue because I could just up the progressive tax in order to match your. Does that make sense?
No, that doesn't make sense. That's actually a logical fallacy. The standard in the resolution is inferiority, and I'm arguing that my tax is superior to yours because I can create a tax that exists on a postcard that generates more revenue than a tax code that exists in 79. My tax does not allow for the possibility of escaping that tax code, of using a loophole or a workaround to get through it. Implies a standard of complexity that I have given you an example of in the status quo, but actually you shoot yourself in the foot by multiplying that standard of complexity by arguing that somehow we're going to be able to objectively determine how much the rich owe to society because they utilize things like courts and like trade agreements, but we're just going to somehow intuitively know how much the poor owe to society. That is an absurd standard of complexity that would be impossible to codify and would only create a more complex system. So again, a progressive tax is inferior to a flat tax, even through your own analysis.
No. Okay, hang on. You've actually non sequitured there. Inferiority. One of the point I'm addressing is specifically the idea that more revenue is a standard by which you're addressing inferiority. A 15% flat tax might generate more revenue, but a 5% one won't, and a 2% one won't. How much revenue you generate is a feature of what you set the taxation level at. It is not related to the type of taxation system you use, right? So that is not the debate. The debate is, given that we have a tax target, do we grab more of that tax target from the rich from the poor? Which is what I would suggest to, it's a fault of your case, is to meet the same revenue target, you would have to take all that tax which you are now giving back to the rich and draw it from the lower and middle income people, which is not fair. The next thing you said, which again you non sequitur to, is that it was a straw man argument that I have to assess how many times people use the courts. Well, by that standard, mate, your first argument was that the poor people use services more. So you would have to assess how much private health insurance, how many times people called the cops and all that shit as well, right? That is not the debate. Obviously, both of us don't have to objectively determine how many services and how many things every single person used in order to assess their taxing system. What we are allowed to do is make assumptions and approximations. I have given some structural reasons why it is more likely that the rich are taking advantage of things like trade deals. Like, if you are benefiting from a large company which trades internationally, you are more likely to benefit from a trade deal than a mum and dad with a fish and chip shop, right? Does that make sense? Like, as in, if your company makes 10 million transactions as opposed to one, then you are more likely to take advantage of contract law than the other person does because you have more contracts. So I'm making approximations, yes, but so are you. Because when your standard is that the rich don't use public services as much, you're assuming a degree of public service use and you're just saying, oh, we'll make it about flat. So both of us are making approximations which are imperfect. What I'm suggesting is that the structural reasons about why it is that mine correlate to income are better than yours. The next thing which you said was about courts. And these statements I think are actually quite intellectually dishonest. Like, everyone has access to the courts about equally. Like, no, they don't. You said yourself at the new introduction that lawyers are incredibly expensive and very complex. How many poor people do you know who regularly go to court with their lawyer fighting for things which are, fighting for grievances against them? It is not like that at all. Courts, particularly, certain courts like contract law, are routinely used by the rich. And that is just not only because, one, they have more need for them because they have more contracts which they need enforced, but also because they obviously have more access, which is why when your first question about do people, benefit equally from courts, The answer is obviously no. The mum and dad in the fish and chip shop, or the person who's just got like a corner store or is just working as a checkout chick, never needs to go to court for their income, but the person who's running an international corporation does all the time.
All right, so let's begin by talking about this notion of complexity. I want to make a clear distinction here for the judges. I actually have an objective standard of complexity. We've only seen two examples of these two tax codes in the round. My example, which is the American Tax Code, which is 79,000 pages long, which tries to do what my opponent is advocating. It tries to determine how much the rich actually owe to society based on the utilization of things like that kind of thing, like based on how much money you make, what kind of contracts you enforce, how much money do you owe to society. That is an almost infinitesimally complicated tax code that's impossible for reasonable people to understand. On the other hand, you have my tax code, which fits on a postcard, which literally requires one basic math equation to determine how much you owe to society. I'd also point out, so on the terms of complexity, we have my solution, which is obviously superior. But now let's talk about this concept of fairness. I like to point out the only way that my opponent is able to demonstrate that the rich somehow magically owe more to society is because he's picked out this obscure example of courts. That's the only way he's able to prove it. I like to point out that he has actually dropped my analysis that I brought in from my first speech, where I talked about fairness. And I talked about how it's actually discriminatory to put people in groups based on their income and then treat them differently, and how that's unfair. And in everyday life, we shouldn't treat people differently because of how much money they have. That's absurd. But furthermore, I'd also posit that, again, that the rich are generally speaking going to prefer public services. They're going to prefer private services, things like private healthcare, education, transportation, so on and so forth. It's proven that the rich more owe to society, the rich owe more to society, is this kind of amorphous concept that they somehow use trade deals more and courts more, and he can't actually quantify that, but it somehow proves this side true. I would just like to point out that my opponent has also implied has created for himself a standard of infinite complexity. He somehow has to undertake this grand endeavor to determine how much the rich actually owe to society. That's an impossible standard. I don't think you can ever meet that. And I would also point out that it's an absurd standard, that we should treat all people the same, and that's what the flat tax attempts to do. We're looking for simplicity and fairness here. We're not looking for complexity and absurd economic projections, which is what my opponent is doing for us.
Okay, first things first. You said we only have two examples of the complexity. The American tax code, by your own concession, includes things like consumption taxes and corporate taxes, which also are a part of those documents. So you were unable to show me that it is actually the progressive element of taxation, which increases the complexity. I will counter, and I will link this below for your benefit, the Australian Individual Income Tax Bracket Code, where progressive taxation is explained so simply that it can be taught to 14-year-olds, and it fits onto one nice web page, which is probably about 2 A4 pages. So that is not a meaningful benefit you can claim. Second thing you said is about if it's just. Now, look, mate, you can't be like, man, my opponent's focused on these obscure examples like courts and trade deals and police. These aren't obscure. How can you run a business without a government to enforce your contracts, right? Like, what's to stop the other person from just not fulfilling their end? These aren't obscure. These are foundationals. These are the prerequisites to starting any business or having any contract enforced. Having, like, for example, an orderly society, which is patrolled by police, stops people from breaking into your stores and stealing your shit, right? Being able to sue people stops people from cheating you. Is unobscure. The next thing as well is your absurd straw man, where you're like, oh man, my opponent, man, he says that because rich people benefit from society more, you would have to find exactly how many courts that are, contracts they did and hone in the bracket. No, I don't. I am simply making approximations based on income. This is the way the logic goes. I provide solid logic that income is likely structurally correlated with high use of things like courts, police, and trade deals. Logic you haven't really disputed, you just called it obscure. I say then that because we know that income correlates with that factor and that factor would lead to you owing more of your income, that we should tax people of that income higher and create a tax bracket for them. That is progressive taxation. You haven't addressed my rebuttal to your side, which is you do exactly the same thing. When you say, well, everyone's about the same. Actually, if you think about it, the poor use public services more, then I could strawman you and say, okay, well, then you have to do the infinitely ad absurdum complex task of assessing how many times people use public services and how many times people do all this and then adjust it. But no, you obviously don't have to do that because I'm debating fairly. Or you just have to level for an approximation known as a flat tax. My level of approximation is tax brackets. What I'm suggesting is that mine is more fair. The other thing you haven't responded to is my first point, that actually the percentage isn't always reflective of the actual sacrifice and suffering made by that individual. So even though in math terms, the person might be contributing equally, to contribute 50% of your income, when that is the difference between feeding your kids and sending them to school, is a greater sacrifice than 50% of an income for a rich person who can do all those things. And the only thing you've stopped them from doing is, I don't know, accumulating a high interest bank account. Yeah, okay, I'll pass the mic.
No, just so we're clear for the judges, I was laughing because an economic system without the government is actually the one that I personally believe in. So that was hilarious to hear your arguments against it. I am an anarchist, for the record. There are three arguments I want to address, which I believe explain why I win. We're going to talk about simplicity, we're going to talk about fairness, and we're going to talk about economics, which my opponent actually failed to respond to the entire round. Let's begin with simplicity. I just want to clarify. We've heard a lot of rhetoric from both sides about who has the simpler tax code. Your analysis in the last speech on Australia's tax code was actually really good. I tried to read about Australian taxes before this round, but I didn't have enough time. But you're correct. The Australian tax code is not 79,000 pages long, but I still won the simplicity battle. Keep in mind, the tax code I'm talking about fits on a postcard. It's this big. My opponent's tax code, at a minimum, fits onto a multi-page legal document, which the average person cannot understand. So at a very basic level, I still win the simplicity argument. I also like to point out that I win on a more metaphysical level because my opponent's approximations of fairness have to translate into law. I'm a student of law. I am no expert by any far stretch of the imagination. But when you make the kind of claim that you want to determine what someone owes to society, you have to at some point translate that into legal text. And when you do, you imply an infinite level of complexity. I think it is absurd to claim that rich people owe more to society, and then you're going to somehow turn that into a fair percentage. Because remember, both sides of us want our taxation to be fair. I'm saying that we should treat people the same. You're saying that you're somehow going to turn these approximations into legal text. That's just not the way the real world works. Let's talk about the second issue on which I win, and that is fairness. And there are two ways that I win. The first is this concept of discrimination. Wrong to treat people differently in terms of the law based on how much money they make. I think that all people have the same inherent value, and therefore all people should be treated the same. I don't care if you're rich or you're poor. I think that you should, generally speaking, be taxed the same, and that you should be treated the same by the government. So in the issue of discrimination, everyone should be treated the same. But I'd also like to point out in terms of fairness that we have this ad absurdum or to absurdity that he is implying a tax code of infinite complexity, one that continually grows more and more complex as society evolves. I am advocating for a tax code which remains simple and fits on a postcard no matter how big or how small your society is. The last thing I want to talk about is economics. My opponent actually dropped this. I talked about in the first speech how a progressive tax code hurts the economy. A great example of this is Australia. Australia is actually hemorrhaging successful businesses right now because there are so many Southeastern Asian countries that are offering such competitive tax rates. And Australia is a country with a heavily progressive tax code. Because progressive taxes penalize you for making more money, I would argue that a flat tax is superior because it actually encourages people to be successful and benefit the economy.
All right, this has been a good debate. First things first, fairness. The first thing I'm going to say is that my opponent continually strawmans me into this ad absurdum nonsense. Okay? He has not responded to the fact that his own standard has a similar flaw. I'm simply proposing the Australian model, right? It has like 5 or 6 brackets or something. It's not infinitely absurd. Obviously, I'm admitting that this includes some degree of approximation, but so does his because he pegged his to how much you use social services. The next thing he said is that he thinks people are the same. People are not the same. And this is the thing which he never addressed from my case. The sacrifice, 50% of your income for a poor person is more of a sacrifice than 50% of your income for a rich person. Because income is instrumental into how much your choices you can make. When you take away 50% of someone's income, when every cent of that matters, means that you are taking away more choices from them, more rights from them, than if you were taking 50% of income away from for who that person simply means it's their 3rd house or their 4th savings account. So that is the analysis he never responded to, which is why I win the fairness argument. Second point, economics. He late brings up that businesses is fleeing Australia because of tax. No, it's fleeing Australia because of wage difference, and that's because that in Southeast Asia, as you well know, because America is suffering the same thing with jobs fleeing to Asia and Mexico. When they pay less, the businesses go there. It's not because of the tax system. The next thing he said, the rest of his economic benefits, which I want to point out, are contingent on him actually lowering the amount of tax you take, which is actually what I can do as well, right? the debate is not how much tax do we take from the population. It's given that we have a tax target, where do we take it from? Which is where my analysis kicked in, which you didn't respond to, which is if you take it away from people who would have spent it, i.e. poor people who need to spend every drop, then that hurts the economy. Whereas if you're going to take it away from rich people, which is my side, that money was just going to sit in the bank anyway. It wasn't doing anything for the economy, and he never responded to that point, which is why I win the economics. The only point he does win, although I think it is a very unimportant point, is simplicity. He says, my thing can fit on a postcard, his can sit on 2 pages. I would say that that is not a meaningful degree of impact. You can still teach mine to kids who are in year 10. For example, no taxation would be simpler as well, right? But that doesn't mean that we automatically default to the simplest thing. Simplicity at the end of the day, yeah, I know you want that, but yeah, simplicity at the end of the day is not the most important criteria, because if I've shown that it helps the economy and that it's more just, you wouldn't go with it just because like it fits on the